Good morning, everyone. Just waiting for a few more folks to hop on. I should say good morning, afternoon, or evening, and depending on where you're joining us from. Hi, welcome, wherever you are coming from, to this March 2nd Sunday Dharma series that we hold on the second Sunday of every month, except next Sunday, which I'll get to next month, which I'll get to in a second. But this is a fundraiser for the Insight Meditation community of Washington, D.C. And we're so happy to have you here with us as we welcome Sharon Salzberg back for the second month in a row to talk about her new book. So we will get there in a second. If you have not had an opportunity to make a donation, we really appreciate that. We bring these to you every month, and there's always a free option, and there always will be. And it kind of really helps Dharma organizations to be able to offer these kinds of events, support the teachers and the technology and so forth. So much gratitude for that. So next month, the second Sunday is Easter. And so we will be moving this event to April 2nd, and Tara Brock will be joining us to talk about restoring connection in a divided world. So more information will come out about that, but just know that it's on the first Sunday in April. All right. I want to thank everyone who's behind the scenes for these events. Glenn is managing, Margot is managing, Shannon is taking your questions. So as Sharon and I are talking, if a question comes up for you, you can go to the chat and submit that to the Ask Questions Here person, and that will be Shannon. All right. So welcome back, Sharon. We're excited to talk to you about your new book, Real Life, the journey from isolation to openness and freedom, which comes out on April 11th. So before we get into our conversation, I think we'd all love it if you could maybe just lead us in a little settling in meditation.
Sure. Well, it's delightful to be back with you all. And now I'm pondering restoring connection in a divided world. And I'm thinking, wow, that's pretty great. So let us practice a little bit together. We'll be sitting for about 5 minutes. You can close your eyes or not, however you feel most at ease. Just let your attention settle. You can start by listening to sound, whether the sound of my voice or other sounds. And as long as you're not responsible for responding to the sound, see if it can just wash through you. You can allow it to come and go. Of course, we like some sounds and we don't like others, but it doesn't matter. And if not sound, then something like vibration, something happening in your body, something happening anyway, so that we're not seeking, we're not needing to manufacture anything. Let your attention move to seeing if you can feel the earth supporting you. See if you can feel space touching you. When I first heard this exercise, every one of us in the room picked up our finger and poked it in the air, and the teacher laughed and laughed and said, space is already touching you. It's always touching you. You just have to be able to receive it. So see if you can flip into that kind of receptive mode. Feel space touching you. Bring your attention to the feeling of the breath. And here, too, there are alternatives. The breath doesn't work for everybody, but let's say, to begin with, it's the breath. It's just the normal, natural breath. You don't have to make it deeper or different. Wherever you feel it most strongly, nostrils, chest, or abdomen, you bring your attention there and just rest. See if you can feel one breath. And if not the breath, some sensation in your body that's easy to pick up, like your hands touching your knees. And simply feel. See if you can move from the conceptual level to the world of direct sensation, picking up pulsing, throbbing, pressure, whatever it might be. You don't have to name it, but feel it. And here too, the strongest word, the most important word is rest. And if you find your attention wandering, you're just like lost in space or you fall asleep, it's okay. You can realize that you've gotten distracted. See if you can let go and just bring your attention back to the breath or back to the sensation. And when you feel ready, you can open your eyes or lift your gaze and we'll end the meditation.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So before we got on the call publicly, I was telling Sharon that I think that this is my favorite book of hers so far, which then made me wonder, Sharon, what year did you publish your first book?
My first book was Loving Kindness, The Revolutionary Art of Happiness, and it came out in 1995. I've been working on it for many years before then, which you can tell if you ever see the hardcover version, like the blurbs in the back, where things like, we've waited a long time for this book. And Sharon's, and then in his long-awaited first book, and then Joan Halifax had originally written, Sharon Salzberg has finally given us. And I made the publisher take out the finally part, but it was a slow process.
Got you. And now, yeah, prolific. Yeah, appreciate that. So I think as I was reading this book, I kept feeling like example after like every theme that was coming up was kind of like a fresh take. And maybe it's because this post-COVID situation, which I'm going to let you kind of talk a little bit about your intentions for this book, but it's how it kind of landed for me. It feels kind of like a new world, so that maybe like old teachings kind of have like a fresh take now. So yeah, what was kind of your thoughts around what you chose to put in this book?
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. Well, the book was born in my mind when the first year I've had a very isolated life these last 3 years because of having asthma and other things. And so the first Passover that I was in relative isolation, I watched this show on YouTube. I think it's still up on YouTube, which I absolutely loved, called Saturday Night Seder. And it had phenomenal musicians, and it was very funny, and it had rabbis. I learned a lot. Things like the association between the song Somewhere Over the Rainbow and Kristallnacht in the Nazi era, like I didn't know, and so it was a great thing. And it reminded me that symbolically, taking it completely out of the realm of geopolitics, symbolically, the word Egypt means a narrow strait, a narrow place. And so it's the story of moving from constriction and feeling trapped and having no options to a world that's open and expansive and free. That's the journey. And so I resonated very strongly with that sensibility, because here we are in meditation practice, many of us starting out feeling, that kind of constriction and life could be better, but I don't quite know how. And, some kind of closed in space. And we move toward kind of openness, but not like vacuous openness. It's very connected, very loving. And so if we were going to look at within Buddhist psychology, the very classic place is, if you were going to say, when do we tend to feel the most constricted, the most trapped? And that would be greed, hatred, and delusion, or grasping, aversion, and delusion. So, in answer to your question, I thought, okay, what's a very contemporary look at these very classical issues? And so for greed, my watch is talking to me. I don't know why.
So's my cat. So let's
the most trapped, and that would be greed, hatred, and delusion. Okay. I don't know why. And so for the section on greed, I talked more about addiction, and hatred, I chose shame as a kind of self-hatred. And there are a lot of fine distinctions that are made both in Western psychology and Buddhist psychology around kind of a conscience, which is important, even though sometimes very painful. It's onward leading, and some other state we can get into where we're just consumed with how bad we are. And, it's very global kind of condemnation, and that's not helpful. It's never going to free us in some way. And so I talk a lot about shame in there. And then with delusion, there's a certain thing in the teachings about how when we're that confused or we're that spaced out, that we maybe find something that looks like it's going to provide us a refuge in a storm, and we grab onto it, we hold on really tight. And so that's where a lot of fundamentalism is said to come from. And so I talk about that. So I did try to have a fresh take on these very age-old issues.
Yeah. I loved the Seder analogy that you kind of weave through the book. I'm not Jewish, and I've never been to a Seder, and you bet I wrote down Saturday Night Seder and then I Googled when's Passover this year, and it's soon. So I'm really excited.
Yeah.
Really excited to watch that. And this notion of the narrow straits just was so resonant, and not just with the isolation that many of us kind of experienced over the COVID time, but just in our everyday lives, the narrow straits we get ourselves into mentally and emotionally. And you gave some examples of the things we do that cause these narrow straits, like ruminating and craving, really wanting something, or I guess, it's opposite, aversion or anger or anxiety. Like when we find ourselves in these loops, these habit loops, that we're creating our own narrow straits. And it's sort of like, how do we come out of that and into expansion, which is that kind of feeling more connected again. And so, yeah, can you speak to that a little bit, about not just the external narrow straits, but the internal? And then there's so many tools in the book and examples that from other people that were just really kind of enlightening.
Well, one of the benefits, I think, of that whole conceptualization of narrow straits is that the way we might experience even our own shame and then be ashamed of that, or we're afraid of some of these factors, these forces, when they come up in our minds. And so we judge ourselves pretty harshly and kind of mercilessly sometimes for the issues that are coming up, the challenges that we're facing. And so rather than that, if we think of it as constriction, something holding us back, a habit loop, as you said, or something like that, then we can have some compassion for ourselves, which doesn't mean giving in and just like laying back, but it's a different energy with which to be working on an issue. And that seems really important from the get-go. And so a lot of our tendency, once we feel the pain of these things, which is also not that easy, but happens, is to try to abolish them and, reject them and push them away and make them go away and not feel it. And unfortunately, that doesn't work. We're very used to that way of reacting, but it does not work. It's not skillful. It's not going to actually free us. And so learning, it's really a whole other relationship to these challenges, you could say, as they come up, is kind of the point. And it's almost like the holding environment within which they are viewed, within which they are experienced. That's what changes. And so we work on expansiveness. We work on loving kindness. We work on being kind to ourselves. We work on having wisdom, which also will open us. The one way we sometimes describe mindfulness is we say, look for the add-ons. Something may be happening and it's difficult enough, but on top of that, like I'm the only one who ever feels this, or this is going to last forever, or now I know who I really am. Those other 50 million things that came and went this morning, and they don't count. This terrible thing is the one that counts, or I should have gotten rid of this long ago. I've been meditating for almost 50 years, for God's sake. There's so many add-ons that we just kind of dump on top of what was already kind of a difficult place. And so then it's like this kind of big, unwieldy, complicated mess. And we don't need that. We can watch that tendency to just add on and pile on and clutter up the space and be different about that. Mm-hmm. And so that's really a lot of those techniques. Or, like Tara Brach is so famous for kind of widely introducing rain, which would be one of them, one of those techniques. It's a different way of being with the very thing that is arising.
Yeah. I'm thinking of, and, we're going to be exploring this probably the rest of the year with our second Sunday Dharma speakers. But this notion that when we become disconnected, we cause harm to ourselves and others, as we're kind of, most of us are hoping that we're going to come out of this delusion that we're in as a country, a world, or, whatever. And that it's that kind of that sense of separation that leads us to so many of our protective habits that that kind of go on to cause harm. So I'm kind of thinking of the folks who are really struggling with anxieties and health issues and loneliness, and like to just say, well, connection is the answer. It's kind of like, the book gives some like steps for first connecting back with yourself and nature, and not necessarily like throwing yourself back in with people, but different, like how would you define connection?
Well, I don't know that I could define it in a way that was, any different from the way people use the word. But I think what we don't realize or appreciate is that when we are listening to somebody like a stranger and we really listen, that is a moment of connection. We tend to, if you think about loving kindness, for example, we tend to think about romantic relationship only or something like that. Mm-hmm. In fact, when I wrote a book several books ago called Real Love, mm-hmm. and when that proposal was kind of being shown to different publishers, one publisher said, the love market is saturated. And I think clearly they meant the relationship, how to find a relationship, how to keep a relationship, how to end a relationship. That market might have been saturated, but that's not what the book was about anyway. So to take a moment and connect, or take a moment and thank somebody, or take a moment and be kind. Those things actually build a kind of reservoir within us of not feeling so alone. And it's fascinating, when you talk about loneliness, because people say there was an epidemic of loneliness, not just in the US, but in different places in the world before the pandemic. And I used to read those clinical studies about various ailments and things that were helped. The healing process was helped by social connection. And I kept thinking, it can't only be a numbers game. Like, I've only got 3 friends, I need 8. But there's some inner sense, because I know, and maybe we all know people who live in relative solitude, but they feel tremendous connection to others, to the world, to the planet, and they're not bereft, or feeling so not belonging somehow at all. And so working on that inner sense, I think, is very, very important, and it's very impactful. Mm-hmm. And it can manifest, like I said, in these very small ways. And it makes a difference in our lives.
Yeah. I had some tape flags in this book, and one of them was around, so you were quoting Sebene Selassie, a teacher who was quoting the late Zen teacher Charlotte Joko Beck, and I just loved the way, I guess it was Joko Beck who said, joy is exactly what's happening minus our opinion of it.
Right.
Love is the ultimate expression of joy and freedom. Joy, freedom, and love could be considered synonyms for each other and for belonging. But yeah, that joy is what's happening minus our opinion of it.
And sometimes, the opinion is it's not originally our own. It's borrowed in a way, We've been trained, like I hear cherry blossoms are blooming early in DC, mm-hmm. which always makes me think of the time that when I was coming to DC more regularly, and I got to that area, the basin with all the cherry trees, once at night. And then the next year I was back, and my friend heard I'd only gotten there at night. And, this is the place where the cherry trees like bloom at once, this whole collection of them. And it's very beautiful. And that's cherry blossom season, which is like a giant tourist thing. It was anyway. And so she was determined we were going to get there during the day. Determined. So we did. We got there during the day, and I was just awed. I thought, this is so beautiful. Like all these delicate pink blossoms, and they're all coming out at once. And then my friend said, oh no, it's past the peak. And I thought, oh no, it's past the peak. I'm not having a good enough experience. This is not that beautiful after all, right? And always think of that when I think of DC, and I always think of that since I was told that cherry blossom season is happening like now or quite early. But there's so much that comes our way that tells us who we are and what we should be feeling, and all these stories, these narratives others weave about us, and we kind of step away from that and come back to, as you say, a deeper connection to ourselves and what do I want? What's happening for me right now? And there's a certain sense of wholeness in that.
Yeah. Yeah. Cherry blossoms are in a week or two, right? Or I'll have to remember that. I'm usually out post peak as well. So it kind of always strikes me that so much of this practice, and I say this a lot when I'm teaching, is grounded in courage. Like to undertake the path at all is kind of wild that people do it. And so I'm always kind of liking to give props to people that have stuck with it, because it's really inevitable that we're going to bump up against our own thoughts and patterns, and then we learn that we have to let go of that. And so that kind of kept striking me through the book, as well as in terms of like being clear and seeing clearly like what our habits are, and what we need to do to kind of let go into the unknown. I think one of the parts in your book is like going from the known to the unknown. And that's a heavy lift. So yeah. I think it's interesting when people think they're going to, come to a meditation class or read a book and that things are going to get better immediately. And sometimes, they take a little dip as we realize, wow, the patterning and conditioning that's so strong that we're actually having to like acknowledge and rest in before we can actually move to make a change. So I don't know that some of these anxieties and habit patterns that we're talking about releasing, wow. This is more of like a general Dharma question, right? But I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? Like what kind of fortitude we have to stick with this?
Well, I think that's true. They're very beautiful and wonderful things that happen too, so it's not just a confrontation with what's hard. But some of it is wisdom, it's understanding, which is strongly reinforced by either community or teacher or just study. It's like I tell the story in the book about my first teacher was S.N. Goenka, and it was January of 1971. And I was 18 years old and I was very naive. And I'm somewhat famous amongst the group of people who were at my first retreat, who I met then, like Joseph Goldstein and others, for once having marched up to Goenka and saying to him, I never used to be an angry person before I started meditating, thereby laying blame exactly where I felt it belonged, which was clearly him, It was all his fault that I was feeling all this anger. And needless to say, I'd been hugely angry before I started meditating, but I hadn't seen it, so clearly. And he laughed and he worked very much on a purification model, which was the idea that it was great for this stuff to come up in your awareness, because that was the process of releasing it, and so you wanted to welcome those things, which took me a long time to get to, but it was a context that was ultimately really helpful, and there are many contexts of understanding that can be helpful. And then there's also there's this whole part of the Buddhist teaching which we don't necessarily talk about that much, called gladdening the mind. And that idea is that suffering itself is not the point. We're not going to get much out of suffering. And we know that, right? We know probably each one of us knows someone or many people who've had adversity or sorrow in their lives, and they are bitter and they feel isolated and they're stricken by it, and other people may go through stuff, sometimes even, terrible, far more terrible things. And there's something in them that doesn't reject others, that cares about others, and metabolizes it in a different way, and so there's this whole section of the teachings about saying it's hard to confront suffering and not get overwhelmed or feel broken. So here's one thing you can do. You can build up all this kind of inner strength and openness and flexibility and love, and take that with you into that confrontation. And so how do we do that? We practice generosity. It's a lot of life practices, like if you practice generosity, you will have a kind of joy that's not tied to like the amount you can give or something like that, but it's the act of giving, of sharing, of wanting to be a part of something. We practice morality, which is not to be repressive or weird about things, but to understand, like our lives can either be complicated or simpler. And if we choose complicated, it's going to haunt us in some way. You're going to have to try to juggle, deceits or, try to figure out what to say. If you choose simplicity, you can have this sense of freedom. Practice loving kindness, like actively practice loving kindness for yourself and for others. It will give you a whole other way of relating to the next bout of fear that you go through, or doubt, something like that. So there are all these building blocks that we actually can exercise and strengthen, so that it's still hard, of course, sometimes. And yet, it's very, very different.
Yeah. Thank you. Just want to remind folks to send your questions, if you have them, to Ask Questions here. We'll be getting to those in a little bit. So one of the tools, I guess, that you mentioned is in either a chapter or a section called Widen the River, which is kind of a metaphor for, I guess, expanding the container that the difficult kind of emotions are unfolding in. And I guess the window of tolerance, I'm forgetting now whose quote that is, whose theme that is. But how does our practice allow us to do that?
Yeah, it's Dan Siegel, and it's sort of his psychological theory, so to speak. And it has, a lot to do with what I was describing before. Like, you can't insist the fear not come, as one example. Like, I'm beyond that now. I've been practicing for 50 years, done with that. And certainly some of the challenges we face lessen in intensity, or they lessen in frequency over time. But we don't have the ability to say, gone, never to return. Because when conditions come together in a certain way, look at that, it's back. But that doesn't mean you failed or that things have gone wrong, because everything is going to be about how you approach it. So we usually have one of two extremes that we fall into. One is we get consumed by things that arise. We get defined by them. They overwhelm us. There's no space at all. The other extreme is we're so upset and dismayed by what arises that we're trying to deny it or push it away or make believe it's not there or cover it over, and that doesn't work. So mindfulness is described as a place in the middle where we're present, we're open, we're connected, and yet we're not falling into one of these two extremes. Or if we are, we come back, to that state in the middle. And It's a little bit like, I think, in Western psychological terms, it's like realizing you're an adult and my watch doesn't understand. She just said, I'm not sure I understand. Just listen a bit.
Train it. Yeah.
I don't know why she's talking. I don't know why she's listening, for that matter. When you're receiving a certain kind of panic, you're experiencing a certain kind of panic that would have been totally appropriate when you were 2 years old, when some situation arose and it feels like it maybe was a question of survival. But now you're an adult. You can't stop the panic from coming with certain kinds of situations, but you can hold it in a totally different way. You can remind yourself even, I have skills now. I have some tools now. I'm not sort of a helpless 2-year-old. We just open the container with which we are experiencing something and stay connected to it nonetheless. So that's what we learn, that's the whole training. And some things no doubt are easier than others, but it's all possible. Mm-hmm. And, we don't spend a lot of time, generally speaking, without being involved in some kind of practice, we don't spend a lot of time thinking about that even, because the very appearance of the fear one more time is so dismaying, and we get so lost in judgment, like it shouldn't be here. Why is it still here? And I spent all that money in therapy and it's still here. And it's like, I failed. I'm such a bad meditator. It's still here. And it doesn't matter that it's here if we can relate to it in a very different way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I had also written down that I think one of the reasons I loved the book so much, and it felt so soothing and relaxing to me, is reading it, is because you keep touching on the point that this is something we come back to over and over and over, that it's not a one and done, as you say. Like the light bulb doesn't go on and stay on for most of us. Although our practice and the wisdom that we're drawing for grows and changes over time, so that when we keep coming back, it's not necessarily to square one, it's to a different square, but that's part of the process. It's kind of to be expected that we, keep coming back to this. Yeah. It just, it was kind of like, a Dharma hug. Instead of this kind of strictness of it, it was like, oh, right, we're not doing this wrong. We're designed to keep coming back to the moment, which may be difficult or joyous or whatever. The widening the river, it reminded me of, I recently, just like in the last day or so, saw a friend who shared something about grief, which is kind of her specialty. And maybe you've seen this before, but it was one of those kind of visuals, like what people think grief is. And it was like a rock in a jar, and the rock keeps getting smaller and smaller over time. And what grief really is that the jar keeps getting bigger. The rock kind of stays the same, like the thing that we're carrying, but our capacity to hold it maybe changes in some way. Yeah. And so ultimately, like you said, that our practice is not just about confronting the difficulty, but being able to kind of savor and tap into, like Charlotte Joko Beck was saying, the joy is here all the time. And the connection, the love. I mean, if you think, when I asked you to define connection, one of my other questions says love. Can you define? So I decided not to ask.
Well, I define love as connection, so that was easy.
Kill two birds with one stone. Yeah. So I don't know if there's any kind of like theme from the book that you want people to take away that we haven't already talked about before we get to some questions.
Well, kind of the flow of the book, is like here's the journey. When do we tend to feel most contracted or constricted? When do we tend to feel most open and connected and free? And how do you make that journey? Some of it is made with how we confront the difficulty, which we've talked about. Mm-hmm. Some of it is made really from what you just said right now, allowing oneself to savor the joy. And what do we take with us on this journey, which could be like a sense of community? Mm-hmm. What do we want to leave behind? And then it ends actually. And then what happens as we become more free? I wouldn't say like perfectly free, but, as we are more present, we're more balanced, more open, kind of the creativity that can come and the sense of awe and appreciation. And then the book ends with aspiration, just like the Seder ends with aspiration, which symbolically, again, would be next year in Jerusalem at the end of the Seder. And it's sort of like, and then I have a great quotation from Harvey Fierstein from Saturday Night Seder, which he basically defines Jerusalem as a world without poverty, a world without war, a world without so many of things. And that's the toast. That's the aspiration. So, yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, it's a beautiful end to the book as well. So we have a couple of questions coming in that are about how to apply some of these teachings in the workplace, which is, I think, just such a fascinating question, as, of course, we take these practices into our everyday lives. And this kind of corporate environment or the workplace environment is kind of a different animal, where we're almost like expected to have a facade of professionalism, or we talk about not knowing. Being in a place of not knowing is something we, aspire to. Yet in the workplace, we're paid to know stuff, right? So that's always kind of come up for me. So Janice asks, how can you expand yourself past your limiting beliefs in the corporate workplace? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's several ways. One is understanding like what your own limiting patterns might be, and even just applying mindfulness to move toward a little more flexibility. So, for example, I know someone who describes herself as someone who just can't say no. She's just incapable of saying no. So in work, for example, she was often asked to do something by someone else that really was not appropriate. It's kind of like doing part of their job, but she could never say no. And so what she did in her meditation was she consciously brought up one of those scenarios and felt what was happening in her body upon being asked a question like that. And she could feel like right in her stomach, this very visceral rush. It's like a panic coming up in her body. And that was important because in the conversation, that tends to happen quicker than the mind kicks in with cognitive understanding, like, ooh, they might not like me if I say no, if I can't do that. We feel that first. So that became her model. She kind of learned that feeling. And then when she was at work and she'd be asked that very kind of question and she'd feel that come rushing up in her stomach, she would then take the opportunity to say, I'll have to get back to you on that. Like she couldn't bring herself to say no, but later she could say no. Mm-hmm. So we can also see, people will always tell a story about us, but do we take it to heart and believe it? And, are we defined by that, or can we step away? So that's mindfulness. And then I think basic loving kindness, is just like people tell me things like in a Zoom room, with all those little boxes, they might, in the meeting space, they might look from face to face and silently repeat, may you be happy, may you be peaceful, and just see what happens, see what changes. Or, it could be something like, people find a sense of meaning at work, not necessarily from the job description, but from a kind of commitment to bringing their values. And it doesn't have to be showing off or weird. Like, I remember talking to somebody who was answering a phone on a customer complaint line, and she was radiant. She just kept saying, I respect everybody. I can't always help them, but I'm always honest. If I say I'll get back to you 2:00, I get back to you at 2:00. And she said, I just really want to help them all have a better day. And the irony of it was that she was saying this in a workshop I was teaching, and I had just had a terrible experience as a complaining customer where I was like totally put down by the person on the other end. And I thought, oh, I wish I'd gotten you, so we can bring those values to our every call, really, if we think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's a question I think that comes up a lot. Like, people wonder if it's possible to be themselves at work, or to be the kind and all of that. I remember once teaching a lesson on communication, mindful communication, and I asked, we were talking about our communication style, whether we tend to be passive or aggressive or assertive or whatever. And one man said, well, it depends on whom I'm talking to. If it's a subordinate, then I'm this way. If it's my boss, then I'm this way. And it just, wow, I don't know. I don't think I've ever really been in a job where that was required, or maybe that's just, I'm not capable of it. I don't know. It's just like spoke to authenticity. Mm-hmm. Like, I think it is possible, right? To, I don't know, be ourselves, mm-hmm. And stick to what we're saying. Mm-hmm. Like you said, practice. I love that she practiced being with the feeling of saying no, so that mm-hmm. it was more recognizable, mm-hmm. in those moments, because it does certainly happen really fast. Another question about work, and which is more like speaking to the feeling of worth being tied to usefulness and utilitarianism. This is Lucille. I'm trying to paraphrase a little bit. That we often tie our identity to the work that we're doing. And she's got a 95-year-old father who still works. So that kind of makes her feel a little bit guilty and lazy. And she ends by saying, what do you mean by getting real? The call for being real might sound like criticism for people like me, and how to get real and free from old conditioning. So I don't know if there's any.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly it's not meant to be criticism, but I've seen in my own mind it's possible to take anything as a form of criticism and sort of unrealistic or unfair standards for oneself. Mm-hmm. What I mean by being real would almost be the opposite of that. It's just a sense of authenticity. I think if I was going to describe myself as 18, at the age of 18, in one word, it would have been fragmented. I just didn't have a sense of integration in my being. And we describe it, I mean, this is a world and a society with a lot of role differentiation. And people will often say, I feel like I'm one person at work and another person at home. Or my favorite expression of that was probably in teaching. Some years ago, somebody raised their hands and said, I feel filled with loving kindness for all beings everywhere as long as I'm alone. But once I'm with others is really rough. And everyone laughed because we knew what she meant. Or it could even be the opposite. We might feel fine when we're with others and really apprehensive, about being alone. And so we tend to be split apart and divided in lots of ways, compartmentalized. And so one of the things I experienced, and it's what I yearned for, so it was really important in doing the practice, was a coming together of my being. I felt I was who I was, whether I was teaching or, meditating or talking to somebody or whatever it was. And that's what I mean by real, instead of, people think of meditation perhaps as kind of unreal, like I'm going to float in the sky and it's going to be all wonderful, as you said earlier, and it's not going to reflect the last 12 hours, of whatever I went through. And it's just not that way.
Yeah.
But we can experience really being who we are.
Yeah. Thank you. Another question. Any suggestion for staying present while interacting with difficult people? I have an elderly mom who contributed much to my childhood trauma, and she has not changed. How to stay present in her midst while being with her often triggers my feelings from the past.
Well, sometimes I remind myself they're unlikely to change at this point, because there is a certain frustration that can come. But I think what we look for, truthfully, is a kind of balance, some compassion for ourselves as well as compassion for others. Don't feel you failed if those feelings come back, if they come up. Seems inevitable. The gap we're looking for is between that feeling and how we behave, because that realm of behavior is where we could be left with lots of regret. I have a friend who's 88, and he had an experience not long ago where his son came to visit him and sort of yelled at him and sort of had an argument with him about something. And I think they've had a complex relationship for years. But the first thing I said to him was, I bet he really regrets that someday if he doesn't sort of repair, because we do regret it. And so you don't have to pretend you don't feel things, but sometimes people need to monitor the actual contact. Loving kindness does not mean being enslaved to a certain way of relating. Like, people often fear that, like, were I to develop a more loving heart, I can only let them move back in. I can only give them more money. I can only say yes. I can only smile as they're hurting me. It's not true, because there's also loving kindness for yourself. But it's finding a balance in terms of the actual behavior. And using discernment, using understanding, but hopefully not with a heart that is full of fear or hatred, because really, like, we're all so conditioned. And my friend Sylvia, I quote her in the book, although I don't think I use her name in the book, but now you all know. Sylvia Borstein, when I'd be teaching with her, and she would often say, everyone's just doing the best that they can. And I think, no, they're not, really, like, I'm from New York. I'm different. Well, she's from New York too, but, and she'd always say, everyone's just doing the best that they can. And I think, oh, come on. But it's actually true, because if we had more wisdom, if we had more balance, if we were more connected, we would be better. And sort of the way Maya Angelou said it was, this is a little bit of a popularization. I think she said it slightly differently than this, but the popular form is something like, when you see better, you do better. And that I totally got. When I see better, I do better. And if you're not doing better, it's because you're not seeing things, that are there to be seen, but it's not happening.
Yeah.
So I think Sylvia was correct.
Yeah.
I've always wondered if she was going to read it and recognize herself, or not. We'll see.
We'll see. Yeah. We have another question, kind of a couple of questions, actually, that are similar. So lately, most of the time that I sit with a loving kindness or Vipassana meditation, I cry, sometimes sobbing with grief when it becomes overwhelming, or I have thoughts of traumatic events. What would you recommend? When is it wisest to break the meditation process?
It's really going to depend on how you feel you are with what's going on. It's not wrong. It's not bad. You might be too tired, for example. You might just be exhausted anyway. And you feel like I can't like just be observing this to any degree. And you just have to kind of, it's like a catharsis. And then that reaches an end because it's just going to be exhausting you further at some point, and so you can look for that, things like that. But it also reminds me of another story when I was sitting in 1984 with this Burmese teacher, Sayadaw U Pandita, who we brought here to the Insight Meditation Society to lead a 3-month retreat, never having met him before. But we heard he was a really great teacher, and he was a really great teacher. He was also very severe and intense and demanding teacher. And not too long before that course, I'd had a friend who died, and the friend was coming up in my mind a lot. And we were seeing Sayadaw Pandita 6 days a week for these very short meetings, just to describe our practice and get some feedback. And because I was thinking of my friend so often, it was very much what was going on. And I sort of, I didn't know him. I'd never met him. He was a monk, and I sort of didn't want to tell him, but 6 days a week, you kind of have to say what's going on. So I finally said, I'm thinking about my friend a lot. And he said, is it making you very sad? And I said, yes. And then he said, are you crying? And I thought, oh no. And I said, just a little bit. And he kind of shook his head and he said, every time you cry, you should cry your heart out. He said, that way you'll get the best release. And you could have knocked me over. Like, I was so stunned that he said that. And so that was the permission I needed. But in the end, it was really more about, can I be kind to myself in the face of this experience? Can I have some amount of balance in the sense of observing? Because a lot of these emotions are very complex. They're like compounds. You might be looking at grief, but it's also maybe there's some element of regret in there, or guilt, or projection, and we just kind of watch it unfold in all its different layers. And if you're just too overwhelmed or exhausted to watch it, it's fine to take a break, and what?
What does she have to say now?
She said, watch it, Wikipedia. Watch It is a 1993 American comedy film written and directed by Tom Flynn. Very spooky.
Do we laugh or cry? I don't know.
I don't know.
Always listening. Oh, goodness. So this question and the next one a little bit as well, which has more to do with kind of the more common or mundane aspect of struggling with the practice, just like the run-of-the-mill things that come up, the sleepiness and fantasizing mind, and that when we try to sit, it's difficult, and then it makes us want to avoid sitting. And so just as I'm kind of scanning through both of these questions, it strikes me that there's a perception of what it means to meditate. Like, with the first question, when is it wisest to break the meditation process? And then when I meditate, and are there other ways we can be in the moment without this sort of, what are your thoughts on that, so that we don't have to avoid sitting and just like white knuckle it through? But how can we stay in the moment when we're overwhelmed, either with restlessness or grief, without thinking, well, this isn't the right time for me to sit?
I think there are a couple of questions in there, or at least I'll answer it in two different ways. One is sometimes the sitting experience is sitting and being with restlessness. That's what it is. It doesn't mean you're having a bad sitting. It's just, that's the challenge. And it also reminds me, this is also in the book, of my, I was teaching once here at IMS with a colleague named Susan, and Susan had begun her meditation practice maybe like 15 or 20 years before, sitting here at an IMS, and I was one of her teachers. And so this night, Susan was giving the talk, and I was just sitting there in the hall. And she said, so I sat my first retreat. Sharon was one of the teachers. And there was a day when I was so restless. And when I went in to see Sharon for like one of these meetings, I said to her, has anyone ever died of restlessness? And she said, so of course I was really interested. Like, what did I say all those years before? And she said, and Sharon said, not from just one moment at a time of it. And I thought, oh, good answer. Because we feel that moment in the moment, and we think this is going to last all year, and then suddenly we're trying to handle a whole year's worth of restlessness or whatever. But one moment at a time, we can do. And then the next moment. I hesitate, like, with questions that have the word like stay or maintain or keep, because it's not going to happen that way. We're going to lose it. Yeah. Just repeating what I was saying. I'm not sure I understand. Well, that's because I wasn't talking to you. We're going to lose it. We're going to come back. We're going to get overcome. We're going to come back. And that's really the process. The other part of it, which is, kind of a different answer, is that it doesn't have to be like a formal sitting or even a formal walking to be called meditation. We can practice mindfulness, washing dishes, and sort of taking a walk or taking a shower, whatever it might be. It's true, and it's valid, and it's useful. There's a friend of mine, Barbara Fredrickson, who's a researcher in North Carolina, who does a lot of loving kindness research. She did a study of mindfulness where people were not sitting formally, but they were using these activities just as a way of kind of like dropping into the moment, not multitasking all the time, being more fully with what they were doing. And she found it was quite impactful. Now, for me, as an individual, as a practitioner, I really feel like that would start to be just a story I was telling myself. Or you can be mindful doing anything. If I didn't have a kind of formal practice, which could be very brief each day, sitting or walking, no matter what it feels like, even if I'm only sleepy or something, because that sort of gets me remembering or something, when I'm then commuting or washing the dishes or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Marie has a question. How do I feel a sense of connection with the world when I feel I'm being increasingly written off by a society as a disabled person?
True enough. I understand the issue, and reading the question myself in the chat, about wearing a mask and so on. And I really feel for you. I really understand the issue. I was, because as I said earlier, I have asthma, and one of the things I realized, to my shock, pretty early on in the pandemic was I'm a senior citizen. I don't think of myself that way. But as they were defining, vulnerable populations, I thought, ooh. And this year I had pneumonia. I was in the hospital, not COVID related. And so I'm still very restricted in where I go and what I do. And my publisher, For Real Life, the next book is like, they don't know what to do with me, because they said, people want appearances. They want to go into a bookstore. They want to be together physically. And I said, no one's wearing a mask these days, or very few. I don't think I can do it. And they're kind, but there's a little bit like mystified, like, what am I going to do with her? I totally understand from that perspective. There are communities of like-minded people and supportive people, and we need to find them. We need to honor all our feelings. Like the first population of people like you're describing, were actually healthcare workers. When I was teaching, an enormous amount online during the years of the pandemic, somebody had me teach a group of ambulance drivers and EMTs, and I said, well, what would be most helpful? What's going on? And they said, they are so angry at people who won't wear a mask because they feel their lives are really in danger. And people can have different views about the efficacy of masks, but there is data. And, I think you don't have to be in a situation where your conduct is dependent on the views of others. And you don't have to judge others, either, and have a sense of they should be different, or everyone's just doing the best that they can and operating from their own sense of understanding or perspective. And but I would be very I don't know, the word is sort of like, there's a way I use the word proud in the book, and not in a negative way, but in a positive way. Quite Bible verse about pride, this is fascinating. This has never happened before. The stance on self-respect and knowing who we are and what we need is pretty great. And also, I think, gives us permission to allow others to be who they are and to sort of make our way through. So it's both those things. I think finding a community that is supportive, and it doesn't mean gathering with people to complain about other people all the time, but just finding a community that's supportive and recognizing that all feelings are going to be natural, and that we also don't want to suffer because of the actions of others. Mentally, emotionally suffer because they're making fun of us in some way, for wearing a mask. And since that was the specific question.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the things that we've noticed at IMCW over the pandemic does have a lot to do with accessibility issues, and that we've become much more sensitive to issues of accessibility for all types of people who might have trouble either accessing what we're offering, because that's kind of what we're focusing on. But of course, that just kind of extends out into our everyday lives as well. And it's just been such an important part of the practice for me, is in hearing from folks with disability who are saying, hey, I looked at this offering and it said it was accessible, and I showed up and it wasn't. And wow, just like how impactful that's been for us, to kind of incorporate that into everything we do as just a part of our practice of belonging, and wanting to be able to share these practices as widely as we can with other people. So, my hope is that that's not just something that's happening at IMCW, but that many of us are becoming kind of more sensitive to the needs of others around us. Including the masking and all the other things that folks are saying that they need. Yeah. We're coming close to the kind of end of our time. Sharon, I wonder if you would do a closing meditation for us. Yeah, I kind of love, we've got 206 folks on the screen right now. Even just, I usually like to jump to my gallery view at the end of an event like this and kind of take in the image of everyone who's here with us today. as we close. So I'll hand it over to Sharon.
Yeah, thank you. Why don't we just sit together, be together in this way, and offer some loving kindness to yourself and to those here and those who come to mind, using whatever phrases. It's like gift giving. As someone comes to your consciousness, just repeating phrases like, may you be happy, may you be peaceful, but starting with oneself.
Mm-hmm.
And then at some point, those here assembled through cyberspace, including Siri, who's joined us for this whole session. And whoever may appear for you. Those many beings who in some way are part of our being here together. May you be happy. May you be peaceful. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, Sharon. Again, Real Life. Here it is. It's a yellow cover, out April 11th. We hope you will come back again. I'm sure you have at least 10 more books in you. So
I have one coming out in October.
Yep. I knew we could count on that. So we will definitely be seeing you again. We hope you can join us on April 2nd, remembering it's the first Sunday next month when Tara will be here to talk to us, which is always a treat when we get her to come back home to be with us. All right, everyone, have a wonderful day. If you're in the snowstorms, we're thinking of you. Yes, sending love. All right, everyone. We'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye.